The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 11. Agonies and Asps. Early December 1994. If Draco felt sure that Victor Crumb was up to no good with Hermione, Lucius was doubly sure. When he heard this latest twist from Draco, the girl had thrown him over for Crumb. He felt oddly double-crossed. Now that he knew Hermione was likely a pureblood, and the child of the Dark Lord, he had thought, sometimes with happiness and sometimes with horror, of a future marriage contract between the witch and Draco. Whilst it was true they were potentially first cousins, close marriages within families existed, both in wizarding and Muggle history. They wouldn't be the first. But if Crumb got there first, establishing an international expansion of Granger's power, Lucius would be left on the outside looking in. Lucius's left arm itched, and he scratched it absent-mindedly through the dark sleeve of his robe. After a moment, he looked down at it and held his arm up, reluctantly pulling up the sleeve to inspect the old dark mark. By the time Draco was 2 or 3 years old, the Dark Lord had been gone for well over a year. Lucius's dark mark had faded considerably to a mottled grey, a hazy shadow of its former self, and it had stayed that way for over a decade. But in the last month or so, it had grown more defined, slightly redder and darker, more raised from the skin, the way it had been years before, during Voldemort's reign. Lucius wondered if Granger's mark looked the same as his. He resolved to write to the man and ask. Flashback. Early autumn, 1994. Peter belched indelicately, smacking his lips loudly, then licking them indecently to catch the last bits of crumb. It had been a month since he had arrived at the Riddle House. A month since his belly had tried to digest itself in hunger. The time he had spent here had been glorious. It was true, after more than a dozen years of not using magic, or a fork and knife, for that matter, his skills were rusty. The wands that he had found in the locked wooden box worked well enough for him, but he did not trust his ability to apparate just yet. Still, the village of Little Hangleton offered a couple of small pubs, and his disillusionment charm and imperious curse had not suffered too much of a lag. He had a steady supply of steak and kidney pie, lamb chops and turkey legs, the most buttery mash, grilled asparagus with hollandaise sauce. If he dreamed about it, they would make it for him, packaging it in little tin plates or polystyrene clamshell dishes. Peter sat in his pants and socks, with no shirt on, smiling lewdly at the perky, oiled tits pictured in the Muggle magazine that he'd found in the petrol station loo. His hand trailed lazily down his swollen stomach, inching into the waistband of his pants, finding himself half-hard just thinking about the woman in the photograph. She sat on the deck of a boat wearing nothing but skimpy red swim-bottoms, arms propping herself up, head thrown back mid-moan, clearly thinking of him, Peter thought. His fingers were still greasy from the fried fish and chips he'd enjoyed a few moments ago, but no matter. It made things slip and slide more easily in his palm, he thought to himself. How efficient. Within a minute, his eyes were closed, his head was thrown back over the plush, burgundy velvet of the sofa, his pose mirroring the woman in the photograph, his small cock thrusting violently into his squeezed hand. He gasped suddenly, eyes flying open in time to see the spurts of cum shooting up, then arcing to the floor. As he sighed from his big finish, something brushed against his leg suddenly. He gasped again, giving a girlish, choked little scream, cupping his twigs and berries defensively. He looked down quickly. The snake was huge, her head rising between his feet, whilst her body snaked across the room in an S that barely ended at the door, 12 feet or so away. Sitting on the back of the snake, just behind its huge, brutish head, was him. It looked nothing like him, of course, but evil could distinguish evil, and Peter could recognize his master. "My lord," he whispered reverently. "Wormtail." The thing's voice was strangled. "Clean this mess." Late December, 1994. It had been a long autumn and start of winter, just the three of them. The job of milking the snake had fallen to Peter. Peter's fear of the snake was directly correlated to Nagini's distaste of him. Still, their coexistence was a necessary symbiosis. She needed milking, his master needed the venom, and was too weak to do it himself. Voldemort was growing stronger, little by little. Physically, he had nearly tripled in size, now about the size and vague appearance of a small, hairless armadillo without its shell. The sight of him was still repulsive, his skin still raw and red like one huge blister, as though the blood and flesh were barely contained within its translucence. His teeth and eyes protruded from what Peter supposed was meant to be a face. He avoided looking at it when he could. The spindly arms and legs were like those of a sickly, hairless cat, or large bird, all saggy skin and sharp bones and sinew. It was winter again, and Voldemort wasn't ready to venture out, wasn't strong enough yet. But he knew of a spell, a potion, an incantation that could restore him, and Peter was the only wizard available to make this happen. They discussed it at length. He understood what he had to do, reluctant though he was to do it. "It doesn't have to be the enemy, my lord, only an enemy." "Wormtail, you are nearly useless as a servant to me. Had you only kept yourself hidden from knowing eyes, you could have fetched me the blood easily." The hairless, toothsome ball of flesh grumbled from its gash of a mouth. Peter flinched as flecks of spittle landed on his hands and face from across the breakfast table. He'd gotten a village lady to fry up some eggs and deliver them with sausages and toast nearly every morning. Voldemort lay on the table across from Peter, nibbling a bit of the sausage and taking away his appetite for food with his gruesome appearance. The Dark Lord continued, "It may not be strong enough without him. However, with Dumbledore protecting him, I do not see a way to get to him. And I do not believe that his Muggle family's blood will have any magic in it. It is useless. But perhaps Dumbledore is the key." "My lord, what do you mean?" Peter asked. He did not imagine that getting blood from Dumbledore would be any easier than getting it from Harry Potter. "Albus Dumbledore, too, is well protected, but there is a brother." Early spring, 1995. The promise and possibility of that brother is how one evening found Peter disguised in a Muggle wig and glasses, operating into the alley behind the Hogshead Inn in Hogsmeade. An ordered drink, some feigned clumsiness, a precisely broken glass, and, unnoticed as the man fumbled around for a partially clean rag with which to bind the cut, Peter axioed the blood from the barman's suddenly opened finger into a small vial. The blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. Late winter, 1995. Draco was in agony. The past couple of months had been miserable without her. Pansy Parkinson had taken pity on him and offered to go with him to the Yule Ball. He had spent the evening torturing himself, watching Hermione dance, her magical energy overflowing. She was beautiful, resplendent and periwinkle. He brooded in black. This had been followed by more cosy chats between Hermione and Victor in the library. Victor hunkered over the table, pretending not to know words, so that she would help him. Hermione was unable not to answer his question, her kind nature seeing no beguilement. Draco was not above hiding behind the nearby stacks and eavesdropping. He told himself that he was gathering intelligence on a potential covert operative. In truth, he waited, hoping to hear of a disagreement or a chasm between the two. He wanted to hear his own name spoken aloud by her voice. He longed for her to tell Victor to get lost and not come back. Back in January, Hermione had sent them a lovely note along with a visiting photograph that did indeed move the way Draco had said they did. Hermione smiled with a closed mouth as she twirled for the camera with Victor. In the crowd behind her, not in focus, a white blonde head could be seen turning away from the sight. "Oh, look at her dress, Richard. She looks so grown up. I wish we could have been there to see it," Linda said, a bit maudlin, but happy for her daughter. At 15, her little girl was growing up. Richard peered down at the photograph. "Huh, I thought she said she was going with Draco." Linda pursed her lips together. "Yes, she said that he hoped he would ask. But—" "What, did he get cold feet? Isn't that him in the back of this picture?" Richard pointed. Linda sighed. "Yes, Narcissa said he was still going, but with an old friend. She wasn't certain either, but she thinks they may have had a spat." "Ah, geez, young love, what can you do?" Richard answered, resuming the sports section of his newspaper. The owl, known as Colwyn, arrived a day or so later. Richard was the one to open the window for the silver owl, clearing a bit of space on the countertop, so that the majestic owl could shake the snow carefully from his wings, before departing with a bit of Richard's bacon in his beak. "Letter from Narcissa?" Linda asked, coming into the kitchen. Richard frowned. "No, it's from Lucius. He's asking if my mark, my tattoo, I suppose he means, has changed. Why in the world would he be curious about my tattoo?" "Your tattoo, or your tattoos?" Linda asked pointedly, taking the note from his hand. Does he know about both of them?" "Ah, geez, I hope not. Man alive, this one is all right." He gestured to his arm. "But the other one, let's just say, if anyone but you ever sees that one, we've got a problem." Linda tried and failed to suppress a giggle. "And why is that, Mr. Mouse? I find it rather adorable myself." "Well, that's because you're a special breed of woman. Most women might consider losing a bet to one's squadron mates and having to get a cartoon mouse tattooed on one's arse cheek to be a bit of a turn-off." My little Granger Danger mouse. You know, perhaps that's why Lucius thought you were a secret agent. Maybe he watched the show years ago, and he has X-ray vision and saw your Danger Mouse tattoo." They looked at each other and laughed. "I don't get the sense, based on Draco's reaction to that movie years ago, that they've ever watched the telly in their house," Richard replied dryly. "It's a manner, dear. Get it right," Linda chided. "You're right. I forgot my manners, Lady Linda. They've never watched any telly in their manor," pulling her into his arms and swaying her a bit, as though he were at a fancy gala and not in their breakfast nook. "But be entirely honest. If I'd had that tattoo when we first got together, would there have been a next date?" Linda considered for a moment, then smiled wickedly. "Well, your ass might say Danger Mouse, but all I see when you take off your pants is that cobra." "Mrs. Danger Mouse, are you trying to seduce me?" Richard asked, in a mock-stricken-sounding voice. "Good grief!" They both chuckled, and hurried to wash up the breakfast dishes before leaving for work. That evening, when they returned from their dental practice, Linda dropped their take-out on the breakfast table, noticing the letter from Lucius once again. "Oh, Richard, we were so distracted this morning you forgot to reply to Lucius." She squinted at the note. "Still no idea why he wants to know if your tattoo looks different?" "None. Maybe he's thinking of getting ink himself and wants to know how it will age," Richard said, quickly dashing off a note in reply that he would send later. Lucius: "Yes, it has changed a bit over time. I would say it certainly looks different than when I got it years ago." Richard. Once the leftovers from the take-out dishes were stowed away in the refrigerator, the Grangers watched a movie and then got ready for bed. It had been a long day. Linda had dealt with an elderly woman in need of dentures, whilst Richard had done 2 root canals. They both needed some time to unwind. As they lay together in bed, reading, Linda stretched languidly, her hand shifting slowly to her husband's side of the bed, exploring. A smile played about her lips in anticipation. "Yes?" Richard drawled through half-lidded eyes. "I was just thinking back to what we were talking about this morning. I thought I might practice my snake-charming techniques on your cobra," she said, with a sly grin. "Well, you don't even need to asp," he smiled, as she rolled over on top of him to kiss his stomach. Under her chin, she could feel his length already getting hard, and she nuzzled against it with her breasts. She pushed down his pants unhurriedly, pulling his cock free. Oh, no matter how many times she had seen him, held his warm length, tasted him, had him inside of her, Linda could never get enough of this man. His cock was beautiful, thick and long, without being too much, just the slightest curve, ropey with veins. She moaned slightly. The full Monty Python. He let out a guttural groan when she licked her lips. "Oh, fuck, darling. You don't know what your mouth does to me." He bucked up against her at the same time that she surged forward, taking as much of him as she could. His head pressed against the back of her throat as she moaned. His cock felt so warm, so strong in her mouth. The scent of him filled her lungs, and she found herself arching against him, palming his ass with its ridiculous Stranger Mouse tattoo, rubbing against his body to find the friction she needed so badly. She looked up at him, feeling powerful at the way that he was quickly losing control, coming undone under her. So good, he whined, caressing her shoulder-length brown hair, pulling it back out of her way as her mouth and hands came together on him. A few minutes later he pushed her off, pulling her up quickly by her waist. She straddled him with a knowing smirk, and centered his throbbing length under her wet center. She dropped down on him, sheathing him quickly in her warmth. "Oh my God! Yes!" she screamed, as he drove up into her relentlessly. She rocked back and forth, grinding herself down on him, chasing the release, la petite mort, the orgasmic little death that they both needed in that moment. A good grief, indeed. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great78.